Hello and welcome to Season 13, Episode 3 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
Welcome.
That's not what you're supposed to say.
Oh, I am also Bishop, but Mark.
That's true. We are, of course, reading Plato's Republic, the Penguin Classics edition, translated by Desmond Lee, this time discussing Book 2. So last time we discussed Book 1, talking all about sort of the different definitions of justice that we heard from all the participants in this conversation. This time we're going to hear them, two of the participants, Adeimantus and Glaucon, they're going to restate the case for injustice, sort of strengthen Thrasymachus' argument, see how Socrates responds to that. And then Plato, through Socrates, gives sort of an interesting description of how society comes to be. And then he starts talking about education, which takes up the next few sections after that, going into the future. What'd you think of this section, you famous Republic hater? Have you begun hating it yet, or is it still fun?
No, it's just when he gets to the meat of his ideal city, I think is really when he loses me.
Right.
I don't think this part of it, and I'm no expert. I'm no Platonist. I'm not the Platonic ideal of Plato experts. Anyway, I was expecting.
Were you pausing for a laugh track?
Yeah, yes. We'll add that in later. But it is my opinion that the front part of this is very similar to other dialogues in his other books, and but then when he gets into the stuff about the cave and all that kind of stuff, he kind of loses me. But at least that's what I recall. So yeah, I enjoyed this, and I thought this part of it was a little bit more fleshed out than the previous arguments and discussions. Although I have to say, it's been a couple weeks since I read this because we took a week off for various holiday traveling, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right.
So I got to remind myself. I got a bunch of notes and check marks and things circled. And I got to remember what the heck my point was in making all these notes.
Well, that's good. Hopefully you'll recall what you meant.
I guess we just get us started,
yes.
And then I will run with it.
Well, that's good. Well, like I mentioned, we left off last time with Thrasymachus was sufficiently defeated or kind of stepped back from the dialogue after Socrates dealt with him. But now we see Glaucon step back up as well as Adeimantus. And Glaucon says, starting this book, he says, "Do you want our conviction that right action is in all circumstances better than wrong, to be genuine or merely apparent?" And essentially his claim is, well, you're putting up essentially a straw man argument through Thrasymachus, right? We need to build up this case. There's a different argument you can make for injustice that it actually can benefit you more than acting justly can. And so that's the big question that he has to deal with now at the first part. But he says, what do we seek when we do things? What sort of goods are we seeking? And sort of Socrates takes him through this distinction of, what are the different kinds of goods in category. Right. He says, well, justice and right are in the highest category, is what he says to Glaucon. He says that's not the common opinion. He says those are really in the painful category. Those are goods that it's painful to achieve, and really people prefer achieving those first or second goods where you desire for itself and for its consequences. Wisdom, insight, and health you welcome on both grounds, but enjoyment and pleasure you welcome only in the enjoyment that it brings. Right, not just in itself. But justice and right are sort of those difficult things to achieve where they might even have bad consequences for us. And so most people would agree that it's actually not beneficial to achieve those things. And so that's kind of a stronger argument of what Thrasymachus was saying, is what Glaucon's saying here.
Yes.
They're saying,
yes.
We agree that those are good things, but most people don't want to deal with the negative consequences that they bring. So therefore, It is better to be unjust rather than just, so you can avoid all of the bad consequences that come from trying to achieve justice.
Yeah, and really... they're making more of a practical argument because we have a negative concept of injustice. Meaning we just kind of recoil from it. Well, how could you possibly argue that injustice is better than justice? And really, they're trying to be somewhat of devil's advocate in saying, well, wait a second, if we really look at what you defined as injustice, which is unfairly benefiting yourself or just selfish pursuits, just for your own benefit, even if it is to the detriment of everybody else. Why is that why is that bad? Why is that
Hmm.
not justice? Why isn't that the good? Because then it's a net benefit to you. So that is, so if that's the case, then isn't it better to be unjust or an unjust actor
Hmm.
in society? And that's and I guess intellectually it was more prevalent in that time or that age than it is now. I mean, people perceive themselves as wanting to be just now, but really in practice, it's they're probably more unjust now,
Right.
more selfish pursuits now, more, like even down to the minutia of parents not spending time with their kids and just playing on their phones and watching
Hmm.
TV and all that kind of stuff and putting devices in their kids' hands, which just drives me crazy at restaurants. Where you have a video playing at a table next to you.
Right.
You're not at a fancy restaurant, so it's not like, it's some, French, fancy, expensive French restaurant. I mean, it could just be McDonald's, but Lord Almighty, uh, you know, but I think anyway. Back to my point. I was about to go on a completely unrelated rant.
I could tell.
Uh, I was getting warmed up, but I think their argument is that generally people, whether they want to admit it or not, would prefer to be unjust actors
Hmm.
overall because it benefits them. It's their selfish pursuits, and I think they make a pretty decent case for that. And then
Right.
and so Socrates or Plato has a difficult task in trying to convince them, and of course the reader, that no, even if it's not something that just benefits your selfish
Right.
pursuits, it's still better to pursue a just outcome overall.
Right.
Yes,
Because
and as a
that's what
society.
yeah, Glaucon puts forward here because he says, well, what do we think about the nature and the origin of justice? What does this sort of side of things say? What he says is that their opinion is that really justice is avoiding what is undesirable, or really we come up with justice, right, to sort of punish the bad things and praise the good things, and the laws just
Yes.
set up what is just, what is unjust, and therefore people live their lives, acting justly because they want to avoid punishment. He
Mhm.
says that's the motive for pursuing justice, sort of in the state, in the society. But he says everybody's sort of guided by self-interest, and that's where he goes into one of the most famous passages in the Republic, which is the Ring of Gyges,
Yeah.
which is something just this hypothetical or this myth that he's telling. Gyges, finds this magical ring, and if you turn the bezel on the ring a certain direction, you become invisible, right? And so Gyges goes out. He, gets into the party that was to report to the king. He arrived. He seduced the queen when he was invisible with her help, attacked and murdered the king, and seized the throne. Right. And so essentially, this story is, would you, if there were no consequences for anything you did, what would be the point in doing just things, right? If you're just driven by self interest, as he sort of seems to say, then there would be no reason to act justly. It would actually be far better to act unjustly because you'd have all these material possessions, you'd have power, you'd have wealth, et cetera, et cetera. You could have everything you ever wanted if there were no consequences. And so the only reason we think of justice sort of in the state is because justice is the result of consequences. And that's the only way we can maintain justice is through these consequences. There's no sort of out there sort of abstract ideal of what justice is. It's purely based on self-interest and sort of the guidelines set up by the state.
Yes. Good summary.
Thank you. I guess you don't have any thoughts on that.
No, I thought that it's a good, analogy,
Hmm.
hypothetical analogy of, what a person may do with the kind of invisibility ring or whatever,
Right.
in that you might have a net, argue that you have a net positive, and so then there's a discussion of, well, what if people, what about appearances,
Mhm.
what about how perceived, and how does that play into this whole calculation? Because at some point people find out,
Right.
he got to take off the ring and now he's a king,
Hmm.
and so whether or not just acting so-called justly just because it appears to be better, is that a form of justice, or is that kind of a false concept of what is good or just?
Right. I like what he
Really,
says too. This is kind of around section 361C, page 45 for us. But he says, well, let's put up the picture of the most just man, right? We've described sort of the most unjust man, sort of talking about appearances here. But he says, beside our picture of the unjust man, let us set one of the just man, the man of true simplicity of character, who, as Aeschylus says, wants to be and not to seem good. We must
Hmm.
indeed not allow him to see good, for if he does, he will have all the rewards and honors paid to the man who has a reputation for justice. We shall not be able to tell whether his motive is love of justice or love of the rewards and honors. No, we must strip him of everything except his justice, and our picture of him must be drawn in a way diametrically opposite to that of the unjust man. So he's essentially saying the most just person of all time would have the worst reputation. He'd have nothing to
Yeah.
his name. He'd be absolutely miserable because to be just, you can't have the appearance of being just. You can't have like
Right.
the good appearance about you if that's what justice really involves. Like Socrates' response after that, because Glaucon's been talking for a while. He says, "I say, Glaucon," I put in, "you're putting the finishing touches to your two pictures as vigorously as if you were getting them ready for an exhibition." So
Yeah.
he's like, "Yeah, that's just about as strong as an argument you can make for being unjust," and it is, kind of a good argument if you push these to their extremes. Surely it would seem that the unjust man is much much better off than the just man in this circumstance.
Yes.
You have great commentary today.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, this is also,
Yes.
I think I mentioned this or alluded to this last time. This is where he describes crucifixion. This is
Oh
in
yeah.
section, right around section 362a, where he says, Glaucon again speaking, he says, "They will say that the just man, as we have pictured him, will be scourged, tortured, and imprisoned. His eyes will be put out, and after enduring every humiliation, he will be crucified, and learn at last that one should want not to be, but to seem just." And that's how he ends with
Yeah.
this picture of crucifixion. Kind of eerie how he predicts the most just man to ever live would be
Right.
the one who's crucified here in this
Yeah,
idea.
so do you agree with that? Like, if you are truly a just man, that you will be repudiated by all others?
I don't think necessarily so. I think in
Mhm.
some ways, yes. I think a lot of the most just people to have ever lived, live lives of humility and poverty. I mean, you think of sort of the stereotypical, good priest is someone who lives, a life of poverty and chastity and obedience and things like that. So it's definitely definitely better to be humble, I think, in regards to those things. Or I guess it's more ideal in most circumstances to be humble. But I don't think necessarily you have to be looked down upon. I think it's
Yeah.
good for people, if you are truly just, people should recognize that you are just. It doesn't require that people don't think you are just.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. It's
I don't
not a
know.
prerequisite, but
Yeah.
yeah, but it may be an outcome or an
Hmm.
effect in a lot of circumstances, I guess.
Right.
But their arguments, it's a little bit further than that. It's like,
Hmm.
if you get a reputational reward,
Hmm.
then it's almost like you're not truly just
Yeah.
by this argument. And
Well, I
I
think I
don't
think
think,
he's what he's saying, and I think it's kind of a sleight of hand thing, kind of what
yeah,
Socrates was doing earlier. He says, well, if he had the appearance of being just, we wouldn't be able to tell if he was really just.
yeah,
So the problem is like,
yeah,
how do we
'cause
tell the truly just man? Well, it has to be the one who has no recognition of being just at all. Otherwise, you don't know if he's being just for justice.
or
Um,
just for everybody to think that he's just.
right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
But of course, a very just person could seem just and actually be just and not just be doing it
yeah,
for the appearances.
yeah. And I wonder how many people are really that way. I think those are few and far between.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, in my experience.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Although you tend to get cynical because people disappoint you,
Hmm.
and you think, "Oh, that's a great person, a real leader," and then you find out they're doing all sorts of crazy stuff.
Right.
Like, oh no, he just seemed like he was doing it all right. Um, no, he's going to prison or
Right.
whatever. Crazy.
So then after Glaucon's done, Adeimantus steps in, and that's where he gets really into appearances and sort of the
Yeah,
benefits of being just and unjust and things like that. Kind of, repeating a little bit of what Glaucon has already said, but a little bit stronger. But he says, he quotes some of the Greek poets. He quotes Hesiod, evil can man attain easily and in companies. The road is smooth and her dwelling near, but the gods have decreed much sweat before a man reaches virtue. He also quotes Homer. He says, the very gods are capable of being swayed. Even they are turned from their course by sacrifice and humble prayers, libations and burnt offerings. When the miscreant and sinner bend the knee to them in supplication. So I think in some ways it's easier for us now, in a very Christian world, to be able to consider justice just as a
Yeah.
thing with sort of an objective standard. But of course, for them, if you were a Greek pagan, justice, if it's dependent upon the gods in some way, well, the gods are very easily swayed.
Yeah.
That's a big component of a
They
lot of
were
the
fickle.
myths, right? They're very fickle, right? And that's a big part of the pagan religion is sort of appeasing the gods and having them act, propitiously to you and things like that. So I think it's a little bit harder for them to even conceive of sort of the objective, abstract justice in a way that's not, I don't think, quite as difficult, but I mean, still hard to live out in practice for us.
Yeah, the message from Jesus is so hard to live up to.
Yeah.
And then if you combine it with a lot of the Old Testament stuff, it can be confusing, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, and because he talks about the Pharisees, and but then he wants you to live this this ideal of humility and really poverty, but then there's other messages about, paying taxes and taking care of your family and honoring your father and mother and your wife
Hmm.
it's so some of it, it really is. It's not. I mean, I think having Jesus as the ideal and having a really brilliant theological and philosophical system that isn't fickle and doesn't have decisions based on whims or
Hmm.
the prejudices or anger of the deity or the gods or whatever. I think is much better for us,
Yeah.
but it's still not easy,
Right.
to figure out, you know, should you, like one of my biggest criticisms of Karl Marx is that he was basically let his children starve.
Hmm.
But if you were to live a life of poverty, wouldn't that be the result?
Right.
Like true. You forsake all money
Hmm.
and all wealth, and you give it to the poor. Well, what about your obligation to your family? And to yourself and to your community. So it's not easy.
Right. Right.
What is a just life if you have some business sense and you can create wealth for
Hmm.
the community. I know a lot of people that are, either small or medium or large sized business owners. Well, not large, but are smaller, medium sized business owners. They're great people and they do a ton of charitable work that nobody knows about. And, but they're wealthy, and so then, the Jesus' admonition about, getting into heaven. I haven't, oh my Lord, would it have been better that they, but then there's the parable of the three servants, the one that you know digs a hole and hides it, and then just returns it without any gain, and he castigates that person,
Right.
you know, because they didn't serve the master's interests, I guess, so to speak. You get kind of like using your talents analogy, but anyway, I think this whole discussion of justice is timely, and I don't think Jesus solves it for us because it's so hard to know and to understand.
Right.
Do you?
Right. Yeah.
Am
No, I mean,
am
I
I
think it's
going off on a rambling nonsense there? I thought it
no, I
was.
think you're right because I mean, I think it's true now that we do. I mean, know what justice is, kind of properly defined, within Catholic teaching and things like that. But I don't think that makes it any easier to live out.
Yeah,
Right? We don't necessarily have to ask and ponder, oh, well, maybe justice is just doing the whims of the gods and things like that. But at the same time, it's not an easy thing to do, right? Just because
yeah.
we have an idea of what it is.
Well, then I really struggle. Like I was reading the excerpt that you read about you have your what do you call it? You give alms to the gods. Well, we kind
Hmm.
of do that with God. Like your prayers, and we ask for intercessions, especially Catholics. Of course, the Protestants, some of them think that's worshiping false gods and all that, but
Hmm.
which I take their point. Um, but he does. The scripture does say to pray. It's like, well, why?
Mm.
you know, what are you gonna change your mind? Uh, you know,
Well, I think it's prayer, like I guess the technical definition is asking for your will to be united to God's, right? Doing
Yeah.
what God wants for you. So it's not you trying to change God's mind in any way, but praying for the best, for your life according to the plan, to
Yes.
providence. Yeah. So I guess,
But,
if you have kind of a
but a
warped
lot of
idea of prayer, where it's like, God, give me, $500 today. I guess that could be seen in
don't
the.
you think that that's what a lot of prayers are?
I think so. Yeah.
I think I think most, well, I don't know who knows. I don't know what people pray, but I think a lot of people pray for stuff.
Yeah.
Not like not necessarily, $500, but like give me this or of course, yeah, I guess forgiveness. Um, after you've done something bad. It's not. I mean, I'm not advocating against prayer.
That's
Although
good.
I know it sounds like I am, but I think my thought about how and what you were talking about, like, well, you're going to ask these gods for for some accommodation or whatever because you made a sacrifice to them, either a sheep or gold or whatever,
Hmm.
and so then they're like, oh, or this pleases the gods, so they're going to reward me.
Right.
I think there's some of that transactional feel
Hmm.
for a lot of prayer. And of course, that was like what got the Catholic Church really carried away with the indulgences and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But it built beautiful churches.
That's true. That's true.
So,
Um, yeah, to turn back to Adeimantus because he's just about done here. It really, he goes on this long, sort of diatribe here about all of the different appearances of things. But the question that he poses to Socrates here at the end is he says, "Prove to us, therefore, not only that justice is superior to injustice, but that irrespective of whether gods or men know it or not, one is good and the other evil because of its inherent effects on its possessor." So kind of going back to the three different kinds of goods, where he says, well,
yeah.
justice is a good in and of itself, regardless of the consequences. And he says, well, it must have some inherent effect on the person who possesses justice, and that must be a good thing for someone to have, those effects of justice, if justice is truly good.
And I wonder, like, when I'm reading this, like, what their concept of the soul really
Yeah.
was. Because it's a little bit that they're talking about benefiting the person. And I don't know if they have the same concept of like almost a separate eternal soul the same way we do because
Hmm.
they have a different concept of the afterlife, Hades and the river Styx and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting how they talk about benefit because I think that's the real a fundamental difference in how I look at their arguments than what they're making. That they're more materialistic, don't you think?
Hmm.
As far as benefiting the person, it's almost like they're benefiting that person's character or I don't know, to facilitate their effectiveness in society almost, as opposed to their eternal soul and
Right.
whether they'd be damned for being bad people.
Right. Well, I think we'll talk about that a little bit later because I mean that's a lot of
Yes.
this dialogue is about the ordering of the soul, right? And its different
Yes.
parts, like the
Right.
rational and the emotions and the desires and things like that. But as far as like the eternity of the soul, I don't know if I'm enough of a Platonist to really answer that question, but I think it has to do with the forms, right? With like the rational part is
Right.
somehow united to the eternal form. So he has some notion. I think this is very different from a lot of the Greeks of his time. Some notion of kind of an immortal soul. I'm sure that's a big item of debate of people who are scholars of Plato, though. So I don't know, speak too strongly. Um, but this is
Might
where
as well. Nobody's listening to us anyway.
that's true. Um,
Actually, our numbers are up. Have you
yeah,
noticed that?
yeah, yeah, they are. I don't know why. I
Like
guess we have a lot
10
of
times what they
yeah.
were.
But this is
People are
then
monitoring.
they sure are. But this is where Socrates really turns to what the Republic is about.
Yes.
'Cause he says, well, to answer your question, let's sort of ask, well, can justice be a characteristic of an individual or a community? And they said, well, yeah, it can be a characteristic of both. He says, well, therefore, it'd be easier to describe it on a larger scale and use that sort of on analogy to the smaller scale. And so this is really where he gets into, well, let's describe what a just society is. And that's where we get into the ideal society here, the ideal republic that he'll talk about here. He says, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of this dialogue is really tackle what is the ideal society. And then we can map that to what is sort of the ideal just soul. How do you
Yeah.
order the society? How do you order the soul based on that?
Yeah, and I think that's where he jumps the shark, so to speak, with me. With me, it's
Yeah.
like I don't know that it's an accurate analogy, and I don't think it works.
Yeah.
because it's so different.
Hmm.
And there's different responsibilities, and a person will always know everything the person does, but entire neighborhoods in a city will not know what is even happening in the
Right.
parts of the city, let alone be in control of it or be responsible for it. And so I think it's such a bigger organism, and
Right.
it's an amalgamation, or what do I want to say, of a lot of many souls, many
Yeah.
individual decisions, and so I think um, uh, I think, of course, I'm a capitalist. I think a lot of the way a society works best is to have a certain freedom of contract. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the fundamental aspects of a functioning city state, is that you have the rule of law, and you can enforce contracts.
Hmm.
It's a fundamental thing uh, that I think is non-negotiable, and I think that that's not necessarily a foundation. It has nothing to do with you as an individual.
Right. Yeah, I think the way that he tries to get it, not to jump too far ahead, but with the point about like, well, it's a bunch of different, souls and none having sort of any idea what the others are doing, sort of actually in a city. I think that's why he goes so far down sort of the totalitarianism almost of like the guardian class, where they have control over everything. They can minutely plan everything. And I think, this is something we'll talk about later, but that represents, the rule of reason over the emotions and the desires, right? The desires and the emotions, which sometimes you don't have, absolute control over, right? And so I think that's sort of the point he's making there. It's like, well, even we as people, we don't always have direct control over whether or not we desire something. And it's the job of the reason to sort of, reel that in and point to something better, point towards justice, rather than just following whatever our desires are. But that's a topic for a little bit later.
Yes.
The section right now, I think I really disagree with, especially after reading, Orestes Brownson, because he's essentially kind of describing almost like a proto social contract theory here.
Oh yeah.
It's been a while since I've read this. I kind of forgot that this is his idea, but he says, well, let's first discuss, how a society comes into being. And he says, really, it's just you have a bunch of different independent, people or communities.
Yeah.
They have to live together and they have to make mutual exchanges on the assumption that the parties stand to gain based on those exchanges. And he sort of divvies things up based on, the different skills of people, right? First, we need food, then we need shelter,
Right.
then we need clothing, so we need a farmer, we need a builder, we need a weaver, shoemaker, and essentially just builds up this society based on sort of mutual need, where it's like you
He,
just,
he describes it like a very simple computer game from like the 1980s, that I would play, where like, well, you have this person's a farmer and they get so many units, and then this
right.
person's a market person
Right.
and they
Once you
create.
have enough wheat, you can hire a new
Yes,
person, but you need to build them a
yes,
house. You need to make sure you have
yeah,
enough wood, right?
right.
Which I don't think
Um,
is
yeah,
entirely inaccurate for how societies tend to grow and tend to specialize. Like clearly when you have more people, you're going to need a lot more specialties and different things as things get more complicated. But I think he really misses the mark, because he starts really from individuals, as sort of the basis for society. As we've talked about in the past, but of course, you're not just born into nothing, right? You're born into a
right.
family, right? There is already some structure over you. There's already some sort of authority, from the moment you're born. You're not just this isolated individual. And I think that's grasped much better by later authors. But
Yes.
for the point he's making, I do understand it, right? That there has to be agreements between all of these people. There has to be some system of justice to keep all of these exchanges. I mean, kind of what you're talking about, sort of the enforcement of contracts, almost seems a little bit about what he's talking about here,
Right.
where it's like you have to make sure everybody's satisfied with the contracts. Everybody's treating each other fairly because they're all independent individuals and need to work together for the good of society.
Yeah, and of course he's making the analogy that that's how a well functioning humans get to manage his or her own impulses and priorities.
Hmm.
Is using the analogy of these different interests of different people, but he really is kind of treating them as cogs.
Right.
Like, here's a soldier cog, and then here's
Hmm.
a farmer cog. And so but I understand what he's saying. And, of course, who am I to criticize the great Plato and Socrates or whatever? But I am
Right.
Mark Bishop, so
That's true.
of
Of course.
course I do.
Yes. But that's when he then gets in a little bit later. This is pages 60, 61 in our edition, around sections 373 here. But he says, well, then we have war at some point. We keep having to enlarge our state, right? Glaucon
Right.
kind of interrupts. He says, well, this is fine for pigs. This is fine for animals. But
Right.
surely, humans, we have luxuries. We have other needs. We have things that are beyond just our immediate, material needs. He says, well, yeah, of course. Then we have to enlarge our state again.
Yeah.
We have to have hunters and fishermen and artists, sculptors, painters, musicians, poets, and all of these other, things. But he says, if we need all of these luxuries, well, then surely at some point we're going to need more territory, right? As our
Yeah.
state keeps growing. And then at some point we're going to run into our neighbors in the other city over
Right.
there. And so we're going to have to take some of their territory to support our people, because of course,
Right.
we just have to do that. And he says, well, that's when war happens, right? We will need an army then. To defend ourselves. And then he says, well, couldn't, just the other citizens also work as soldiers? He says, well, no, because, the best profession is the one that you train specifically for. So we have to have specifically trained soldiers in order to fight in a war, because our society's grown so big that we have to have this warrior class. And then this is really where he gets into that ruling class after he
Yes.
talks about, what the ideal sort of soldier is. Where he says, you have to have this guardian class to protect the
Right.
city. And that's where he starts getting into more of the ideal, right? We've moved past the origin. How do you have this ideal guardian class?
Right. Which is the characteristics of a philosophic disposition, high
Hmm.
spirits, speed, and strength. And of course, his interlocutor agree. He says, "I entirely agree." At the end of 66.
They somehow always entirely agree.
Eventually,
Yes,
he gets them to agree to everything he says.
right. So he says, yeah, these are the qualities we need. But then he says, but there's something else. There's this philosophic character, kind of as you mentioned, right, where he we have to recognize when it is good to sort of attack, good to not attack, right? Recognize friend from foe. And he says, well, how do you do that, right? It's one thing just to have very strong men, but that's not enough. And that's really when you get to education. And this makes up a very, very large chunk of the Republic compared to sort of the other topics he
Right.
treats on. And I think I think Alan Bloom even states, well, the Republic's really more of a dialogue on education
Yeah.
rather than the Republic, rather than like a society. It's really more specifically about education. How do you educate a ruler? And I think there's some truth to that. What exactly does it mean to educate a ruler so that they can rule well? And that's definitely something we could be asking more of today.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, that's for sure. And I think we're teaching all the wrong things. It seems like
Hmm.
it's like
Yeah.
you have to overcome our education system to be effective in anything.
Hmm. Right. And this is where, this is,
I can say that because I am a teacher.
yes,
I'm
that's right.
one of
That's right.
those.
Uh, but this is where another big point where I disagree with him, and I think a lot of people tend to as well. But starting in sections 376, right, we start talking about education. And from there, he starts talking about stories, right? That's sort of one of the main ways we educate people, right? By educating mind and character, right? He says it's twofold, right? That's what we should be doing. And how do we do that? He says, well, usually we do that by telling our children stories. Some are
Yeah.
fiction, some have some truth. And he says, well, we have to make sure that our children are being raised, hearing true things. And so far, I agree with him. Absolutely, you should be raising, people to have the truth, and stories should tell some of the truth. But essentially, and I'm not sure if we actually got to it in this book, but it's where he talks about expelling the poets, right? That the poets, the artists, they
Yeah.
are entirely, harmful actually to the state. And a lot of that has to do, I think, is just with the culture of the poets, where he's talking about, the poets who have all of these stories and songs about the gods, right? The gods being fickle, the gods, punishing people, the gods acting unjustly. He says, well, we can't have that as part of the education. There will be no poets in this ideal society educating the guardian class.
No storytellers.
Yes. Um, I do like what he says because he has almost sort of a side discussion on God, and God sort of being singular in this discussion. This is on page 71 for us, section
Talk about
379.
Zeus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
But he says God must surely always be represented as he really is, whether the poet is writing epic, lyric, or tragedy. So he must. It says, in reality, of course, God is good, and he must be so described. And that's what again gets into, well, then, if we have this good God, this apparently one good God, interestingly, this is the cause of all well-being. Good has to cause all of these things, but then surely God would not be harmful. God would not willingly harm people if he is all good. So that's one of the reasons why he says, well, we can't have anyone singing stories about Zeus and things like that, because Zeus is not all good.
Right.
You have all these hymns and these verses about Zeus dispensing evil, Zeus implanting a fault in man,
Right.
things like that. It's like, well, we can't have that, because then God would not be all good if he's willing evil unto the people he rules over.
And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how. Well, I guess they just had a more um, depth of understanding of the fallen nature of man. Because
Yeah.
what I'm saying. I mean, like we often say, everybody's a sinner, but not everybody knows that, and I forget it more often than I remember it. That I'm a sinner. But I guess when you have the Greek gods, every nobody, even the gods have a fallen nature.
Hmm.
That's got to be just a whole different society.
Right.
Don't you think?
Right.
A whole different philosophy of life, where even your gods are flawed.
Right. Right. Your gods are
They're all
vengeful
flawed.
and yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
Hmm.
they're all really kind of horrible people or individuals, deities in some respects good, but
Right.
at least conflicted.
Yeah. He does hit on a good point though that I think a lot of people, still struggle with. But he says, this is on page 72 in section 380 B and C here. He's talking about the poet. He says, he may refer to the wicked as wretched because they needed punishment, provided he makes it clear that in punishing them, God did them good.
Yeah.
Right. So it's talking about justice, right? Sometimes, things that seem bad to us actually work for good. And he says, this is at the page's top of 73 for us. It's in 380 C. He says, one of our laws laying down the principles which those who write or speak about the gods must follow, one would be this: God is the cause not of all things, but only of good.
Yeah.
Which I don't think is entirely true because God, is the cause of all things, sort of philosophical terms, but in the sense that God does not, make evil things. This is, of course, I think touched on a lot later by St. Augustine, who was very influenced by the Platonists with his definition of evil as like a privation of good. Well, God did
Yes.
not create evil. Evil's not a thing that exists. Evil's just the lack of good. It seems like Plato's really already kind of touching on that here.
Yeah. You're definitely ahead of his time.
Yes. I think it's an interesting discussion that I don't think, makes too much sense to us now, but talking about, God being unchanging, which is true. Of course, we
Mm.
also believe God is unchanging, but he says, well, then God couldn't change his form. Saw all these ridiculous stories about, the gods changing their form and becoming animals and things like that. Oh, we can't have those either. And it seems like kind of
Yeah.
an inconsequential thing, after talking about,
Right.
the gods being, vengeful and evil and things like that. And, well, they also can't change shape. But I guess if you want to be very consistent on depicting God, you can't also have God, changing shape and things like that.
Yeah. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
Of course, we have a God that came down and became human.
Yes, that's right.
That there's some similarity there.
Hmm. I'm not sure what else to say as we conclude book two, but mostly
I
he's
think
saying
we're
just
wrapping it
about,
up.
yes.
Yes.
Really what he comes down to is we cannot have any poets telling falsehoods, right? If we want to have good leaders, we have to have the poets always telling the truth. We have to have very strict laws in the society about what they can and cannot say. And I don't think it was in this section, but probably the next section we read, he'll talk about just expelling the poets altogether, because in some ways all of that art is a facade or something. It's not really the truth. And so to get to the truth, you can't have that sort of thing. If we want educated leaders, they have to be educated in only the truth.
Yeah, and I think the that would be analogous in modern times to like television and movies.
Right.
Don't you think? I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's that's where modern poets are.
Hmm.
I mean, really, the only poets we have are musicians.
Hmm.
Um,
I mean, even them, they're not, spouting the greatest things all the times.
no, but they're saying something at least. I don't know. They spend some time on their lyrics.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Not much of it's inspirational. Although William Shatner's album really is poetry. Uh,
So I've heard.
He's, Have you heard the album?
I've heard the album. Yeah, I've heard you play it many times.
It's great.
It's
Uh,
something.
yes, it's really good. So there are, modern poets, but yeah. So I mean, and I think what he's proposing is truly revolutionary.
Hmm.
Because the poets are were very prominent
Right.
in that society as far as the entertainment. I mean, that's what they
And
had.
in,
They go see poetry.
and in some ways, they were kind of, the sacred scripture of the time, right? Like
Yeah,
they didn't have
for
a
sure.
Bible necessarily, but Homer and Hesiod, the Theogony and, the Iliad and the Odyssey and things like that, right? Those were religious texts,
Those are
right?
poems. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're poems. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but in saying, well, we have to banish those guys, that would have been, really pretty scandalous
Right.
to the Greeks back then.
Yeah, big time.
Part of the reason why I guess they, killed Socrates and all corruption of the youth.
Had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, probably. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts on book two of the Republic?
No. Do you?
No.
Do you have any other final thoughts?
No, I mean, I enjoyed the section. I really disagree with him on the origin of society and things like that. But other than that, I think it's good.
I feel like I haven't carried my weight this time. I'll have
That's
more rants next time. Well, I guess next
go ahead.
time we'll be in
No,
person. No,
we'll probably have one more over Zoom, but then a few in person for
yeah,
Christmas.
we'll close this thing out probably.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe.
Depends how fast we go, I
Yeah.
guess.
Well, I think there's 10 books in the
Well, there you go.
so we'll still have some more, I think, after Christmas break.
All right, very good.
All right. Well, if you have no other final thoughts, you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. This has been season 13, episode 3. I've been Adam Bishop.
And if anybody wants to win a official Unlimited Opinions matchbook,
That's right.
just message us or comment on our Twitter account, and then we will ship you
Mhm.
the limited edition.
Yes. Comment
Match.
specifically. You want an Unlimited Opinions match.
The only downside is you got to provide us with your address. We have to get it to you.
That's
Or
true.
I guess I could provide my address and you can come pick it up.
I think that's a terrible idea.
I'll give them my work address. I'm on the internet. They can all find me. Anybody can find me.
That is true.
Yeah, find out where I'm at right now.
That
Although
is true.
by the time they hear this, I may not be at this exact location.
That's true. That's true.
But anyway,
Well, I guess you did
So-
have some final thoughts.
yes, just pushing the matchbooks.
There you go. Well, I have been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.